Good evening, everyone. This is Professor Hill. This is a short video for our class, Introduction to Ethics, Philosophy 2306 here at St. Philip's College. This is the Summer 1 session, and today is Thursday, the 17th of June, 2021. We have an assignment due tonight and another one on Sunday night. But I wanted to do a little bit about objectivism and relativism from our current reading, chapter 2, and raise one particular objection to the fact that in chapter 2, our author, Louis Vaughan, just kind of flatly states that objectivism is the one right moral theory, but doesn't really talk about it. He only gives you the one sentence where he says, this is the right one, and that's it. He spends the rest of the chapter talking about relativism and what he doesn't like about it. Now, there's plenty in terms of being able to attack relativism as an intellectual theory, but I wanted to do a little bit of that for objectivism simply because he left that out. So this is what I want to talk about tonight in a short lesson, which it bears on the essay due tonight, but also Sunday night and for the rest of this short 5-week course. So these are important lessons we're going to need for the rest of our experience together. So it turns out that, let's talk about chapter 2, and objectivism and relativism. Now it turns out that I mentioned he has this little brief, quick review box right at the beginning of the chapter. And in it, he just says, objectivism is the view that some moral principles are valid for everyone. And so this is the thinking that morality is about rules and principles, moral principles that we learn and then just apply to difficult moral situations in which we find ourselves. So, for example, there are these principles, there are these rules, and we can rely on them. And we're going to see some more of this when we get to Immanuel Kant, and he's going to be talking about rules which cannot ever be broken. And when we get to these kind of imperatives, when we get to these rules that must be followed, the thinking is that some of them are just so simple and so easy that you'll see right away, almost kind of intuitively or naturally, that this is a rule, it's a principle, and it should never be broken. In fact, it's going to apply to everybody all the time, everywhere. It's this kind of universal principle. It's a moral principle that's valid for everyone. Doesn't matter what your society is, doesn't matter when you live. So whether you live in Germany or South Africa, Australia, China, now, 100 years ago or 50 years in the future, doesn't matter. These are rock solid rules and principles we can rely on for guidance in making ethical decisions and as a foundation for knowing what's good and bad, right and wrong. Because I've been asking you to tell me what you think. Is this situation, is this case study, is what happened good or bad, right or wrong? But then why? Where does that come from? How do you know? What's the touchstone that tells you whether something is good or bad, right or wrong? And so, for example, here's a moral principle. It's wrong to kill innocent children in a classroom. And these are the faces. We're coming up next year on the 10-year anniversary of the Sandy Hook shooting. It happened in an elementary school in Newton, Connecticut. And as you can see, these little children, there were 20 little children who were killed, and then 6 of their teachers. And it was a terrible story. And I want to be the first person to jump up and say, this was wrong. And it was a tragedy, and it was a horrible thing that happened. Now, out of this, there comes lots of people fighting over what's the appropriate public policy to have around firearms and gun control, and all of these things flow from that. But there's widespread agreement that what happened was the killing of these innocent children was wrong. And objectivists look at this and they say, how can anyone think that this would be justified or morally acceptable? And it doesn't matter what country you're in. It doesn't matter whether you kill a bunch of children anywhere. Like I said, South Africa, China, and it doesn't matter whether you did it 100 years ago or 50 years from now. It's a universal rule. So when you look at a situation like this and you see these little kids and the fact that they were murdered, you know that it's wrong. And here's the thing, you make a judgment that it was wrong, morally unacceptable, and then you go to the touchstone of why. Why is it wrong that this happened? And you say, well, because there's a rule, there's a principle involved. And that rule is, it's just always wrong to kill innocent kids in a school. That's objectivism. And again, it has a kind of an appeal to it, which it seems simple. But we're going to get into this question about absolutism, meaning that, well, maybe there's a rule which says it's mostly wrong, or it's wrong some of the times, but not all of the time. And you say, well, what possible set of circumstances would make it, somehow morally acceptable? Well, see, if you're an absolutist, you don't want to even have that conversation. You just want to say, look, the fact of the matter is, there's no context, there's no set of circumstances. I don't care about time or place or culture. None of that applies if you're an absolutist, meaning that you have a moral principle, it applies, it's valid for everybody all the time, and it's absolutely applied all the time. See, that's the thing where relativists come in and they say, well, now hold on. Maybe relative to certain factors, maybe relative to certain situations or conditions, maybe we need to have an exception. Maybe we need to have a little wiggle room. And people, again, objectivists, say, well, what could you possibly think would make that anything other than morally unacceptable? But here's the thing. Let's keep going. Let's back up for a minute. Let me show you a picture and say maybe there is a set of circumstances. Here's the picture. This is the city of Rotterdam. It's in the Netherlands, in Europe. And this is a picture from the turn of the century, 1900, a bustling, busy, beautiful old city. And it turns out that it had lots of people. It was well cared for. It was, again, at turn of the century, 1900, a beautiful place to live. It has canals. It's got streetcars. It's even got little windmills because, it's the Dutch. This is the Netherlands. There you go. They've got it all happening here. But that's before the wars, before World War I, before World War II. And what happens at the beginning of World War II is that the Netherlands is invaded by Germany, and the Germans roll across the border and they bomb the city. And they set the city ablaze with incendiary bombs. And here are pictures of the city of Rotterdam and the St. Lawrence Church, there on the right, as the city begins to burn. Now, at the time, the Dutch government reported that as many as 30,000 people died. It looks like that was not the case. It looks like far fewer people died in this attack. It might just be over 1,000 people, but still hundreds and hundreds of people, maybe thousands of people died when it was bombed. And a really important thing happened. Well, first of which is all these people died, the war is beginning, and this is what the city looks like afterwards. It's just decimated. And again, this is because of the fires that sweep through the city. Now that has a big effect on the Dutch, who promptly surrender. It has a big impact on the Allies. And here's the thing, the next day after this bombing, the British forces, the Royal Air Force, changed its policy. By the way, that's the church on the left there, rebuilt after the war. But what happened was the Royal Air Force had previously said they were just going to be bombing military targets. But afterwards, seeing the Germans bomb the city and kill civilians and say, hey, this was a civilian area, they changed their policy and said, look, we are also going to allow our forces to bomb civilian targets and kill innocent civilians. Not soldiers, not combatants, not people engaged in combat, but children sitting in a classroom. And their point was, we didn't start this war. We want it to end. We're trying to defend ourselves. And the Germans are killing everybody, and they're bombing cities. They're bombing schools. And if they're going to do that, we're going to respond in kind. And sure enough, the Germans continued to engage in a practice of bombing civilian cities, including London. And again, the RAF changed its policy, and the Germans are like, well, we know what to do. We're going to start bombing London. And there's the River Thames. That is London ablaze during the Second World War. Now, and I have to tell you, these were not small numbers of people. In London, here's another picture of the aftermath of these fire bombs. They would fly at night and bomb cities. 30,000 people died just in London. And again, these are civilians. Now, the Allies are doing this as well. So they're going back and forth. And the Allies promptly begin to bomb Hamburg, Germany. And you see, again, a sense of what happens. These are civilian apartment dwellings. 40,000 civilians, men, women, elderly, children, are bombed in what they switched from military bombing, which had targeted only legal military targets. And the legal piece is interesting. We'll come back to this in more detail next week. But at the beginning of the Second World War, international humanitarian law didn't have on the books rules preventing this kind of thing. Because up to that point, up to the Second World War, a lot of the rules about international humanitarian law, or the law of war, the law of combat, was focused on armies and on the navies. Military aviation really took off. It kind of got introduced at the end of the First World War. You had old biplanes flying around, but mostly for reconnaissance. But in the Second World War, the technology steps up and it becomes a major factor, especially when we get to the Pacific. The Pacific theater was all about the aircraft carriers and military aviation, given the nature of the terrain and the combat situation there. But again, the bombing in Europe has huge implications, because the British had switched from military to civilian, and you end up with situations like this. This is Dresden, Germany, where the Allies bombed 3 nights in a row, and it just devastated the city. You can see the impact here. It's incredible. 35,000 dead civilians, often killed in bomb shelters, because even though they were able to get underground in time, the fires that swept up overhead would just suck all the oxygen out of these bomb shelters. And so people would asphyxiate and die because the fires overhead were raging and burning everything and just creating these cyclones of fire and suck the oxygen right out of the place. Horrible, tragic, huge civilian casualties. Now, the United States, at the beginning of the war, like the RAF, like the British forces, had a policy of only attacking military targets. But also during the course of the war, we switched. When we get to Japan, when we get to the Pacific Theater, the general at the time, Curtis LeMay, orders that we switch, again with presidential approval, orders that we begin to attack whole cities, civilian targets, not just military targets. And we reach the height of this comes in March 9th, that night, and then into the early morning hours of March 10th, 1945. There's a massive firebombing of Tokyo that kills at least 100,000 people. The city is set ablaze, and just scores and scores, tens and tens of thousands of people die. Civilians, children in schools. Which is kind of the point and the reason that I'm raising this, which is, look at this devastation. This is Tokyo after the firebombing in March 45. It is unbelievable. Again, Tokyo. So here's the thing, which is in that rubble, in that ash, are absolutely the bodies of children. As a result of our official United States policy of killing children in schools, killing children everywhere, killing them by the thousands as we bombed civilian targets. Now, is it different because it's war? Well, if that's where we want to go to find a justification for this, like I said, the British are standing around with their hands tied saying, we didn't start this war. We're just trying to end it. We're trying to defend ourselves. We've got a right to do so. Sure, we tried using just focusing on military targets, but it wasn't working. And so we think it's justified to do this, to go down this route. And we followed them right down that moral pathway. Do I want to criticize those decisions as being morally unacceptable? I can tell you at the time, you got to remember, and this is the thing that is so hard to believe. We're now looking at, we've crossed over 600,000 dead from COVID-19 now here in the United States. Well, during the war, Second World War, we had about 416,000 military deaths. You add on, we had very few civilian deaths, maybe just another 2. So maybe 418,000 civilian and military deaths. The British were different. They had fewer military deaths. They had about 383,000 military deaths, but because so many more civilians were killed, because their cities were being bombed and burned and people were dying by the thousands, they end up with over 450,000 combined military and civilian deaths. So more combined than we did, even though they had fewer military alone. And this is the thing you got to remember. That's just talking about us and the British. It's the Russians that are the real story of the Second World War. There you're talking about 8 to 10 million military deaths and another 14, 15 million civilian deaths. When the Germans invaded Russia and marched to St. Petersburg, when they are trying to capture Leningrad, it's just a humanitarian disaster. It turns out that to understand Russian culture and thinking today, you have to appreciate and understand the tens of millions of dead during the Second World War that fundamentally shaped their identity and their culture for everything in the 75 years afterwards now. But look, here's the thing. We're talking about morality. Was this justified? Should we just follow the rule, a universal law that says killing children in a school is always wrong? Well, this is a Star Trek reference here. And this Captain Lorca is saying, look, there are rules and rules are important, but context is for king. And what he means by context is for kings is saying, look, there are complexities, there are difficult situations, and maybe sometimes we do have to look at what are the relative factors. Doesn't matter whether it's wartime or peacetime, in terms of justifying actions which you would normally never take. But during the Second World War, was the United States morally justified in killing civilians and killing women and children and the elderly? I mean, even if you buy killing military targets is okay, that it's legal and morally justified, the killing of civilians is much more complicated morally. Now, after the Second World War, international humanitarian law, IHL, creates a huge distinction between combatants and non-combatants and protects non-combatants. It would not be legal under international law anymore to bomb whole cities like we did during the Second World War. You just can't do that anymore. And now, again, this is a thing which is a factor in the complexity of this. Part of it now is also that we have the technology to be able to focus and target military forces in a way that we didn't have during the Second World War. In the 1940s, part of the problem was trying to find the enemy and then trying to bomb them. And it was extraordinarily difficult. They did one study in the middle of the war, the RAF did, which said that when they went back with surveillance flights and took photographs after action reports, they realized that on a typical military bombing run, where they were focused on a military target, less than 5% of the bombs were falling within 5 miles of the target. So the technology was a lot different then than it is now. I mean, they're looking through little scopes and using gravity to drop bombs and not always doing it well. Now, and that's half the reason they were saying, look, what we could do is exert pressure by bombing cities. We can find cities at night and we can just saturation bomb them. Go this way and then go that way. And you know, if you covered enough of an area, you're going to set the place on fire. So in terms of effectiveness, you could be effective against civilian targets even when you weren't being terribly effective against military targets. And that was another thing which went into the calculus of switching the policies. Was it controversial? Yes. Is it a tough call now, looking backwards and imposing our morality on decisions made in the past? Yeah. But it's worth thinking about because it shapes our decisions now, especially when we get into the future ones talking about international humanitarian law and apply to military ethics today, when we're talking about like drone strikes. That history is important and we need to bring it to bear on decisions we have to face now. But look, it is different now. It is 75 years later. This is a picture of me, your intrepid professor, in Rotterdam, where we started this story. That's me on the Pride of Rotterdam, which is a giant ferry ship. There you go. That goes back and forth between Rotterdam and Hull, England. And look, these days, Rotterdam is a giant, busy industrial port. And the Netherlands is not just recovered economically, it is also made before the war, it had a huge role, and after the war, a unique, special role in international organizations designed to prevent future wars, designed to advance international humanitarian law. This is in the Netherlands. This is in The Hague. This is the Peace Palace, which is the seat of the International Court of Justice. So this is when one country sues another country. This is where they go. This is the court for country-to-country disputes, legal disputes. And down the street is the International Criminal Court. Wow, coming up on 20 years now. And a huge, modern, important international mechanism for the enforcement of international law. Again, coming out of the wake of the Second World War, the developments made through the EU, the European Union, and wanting to find a way to make sure that war crimes, crimes against humanity, can be prosecuted on those that commit them. They can't hide behind national sovereignty and be dictators for life and, abuse their own people and attack others around them. So the Netherlands has an important role these days. And I bring up this as a case study about objectivism and relativism because, going back to and starting with the moral principle of it's wrong to kill children, innocent kids in a classroom. Listen, I agree with that. I think that's a pretty good rule. I think that you can't just say it's self-evident, but what you can say is, yes, that makes sense, that is a good, solid rule. That is something that I would teach my children. But also, I want to acknowledge that in some situations, it gets at least very difficult and complicated. We're at war under the conditions we faced during the 1940s. The decision to not just develop atomic bombs, but to use them on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, was that justified? Lots of people in hindsight think no, although the conventional firebombing of Tokyo that killed over 100,000 people, that killed more people than either died at Nagasaki or Hiroshima with the atomic bomb. So, but is it just about numbers of civilians and innocent children? Or should we even be considering these factors at all and just sticking with our rule that it's always wrong and none of these things matter? Does it matter even if we're looking at losing the war, a triumphant Hitler? That's a really, I think, complex and difficult question. I think it's at least an objection that should have been raised in chapter 2 to saying, well, objectivism, this belief that, some moral principles are valid for everybody, everywhere, all the time, and just accept it, that's the right one. I think that's too short. That was not enough. We need to at least look at and understand how complex and difficult it really can be. All right, that's the lesson for this week. Today, June the 17th, Thursday. I hope you folks are out there writing your papers or getting them turned in, making comments on at least 2 of your classmates. And I look forward to reading them tomorrow. So for now, I'm going to stop the share and end the recording. But it's a lot to think about. And I look forward to hearing from you and what your thoughts and reactions are to this very, very difficult dilemma. All right. Take care, y'all. Bye-bye.